We're in Esther 2. This is when Esther gets introduced. This is where she gets crowned queen. Unless you didn't know that, then that's a spoiler alert. But but I think we kind of know the story of Esther, but hopefully we can see it in a little bit of a deeper way here. So the theme of Esther that we talked about last time is the providence of the hidden God. God's not named, so we see God as the invisible God. We see him working through normal human events, which is the doctrine known as God's providence, where it's not that God can't use miracles or sometimes doesn't use miracles or prophecy or directly speaking to people or things like that. He does, and we see those things in other places in the Bible. But in these cases, he also uses normal things. He uses normal things in our lives. He uses normal things in all the details of what's going on in the world to accomplish his ultimate goal. And then what we see is, even though God is most hidden, that's when he's present the most as well. And so I wrote down some points on the board to kind of just break down the chapter a little bit and to look through some of these things that we can explore a little bit. So you see like the Xerxes decree, we see Mordecai and Esther, the kind of main characters, introduced. We see Esther finding favor with those around her, and then the king's choice, and then the plot where there's these these eunuchs trying to kill the king. Let me read a quote from this theologian named Schreiner. He writes a pretty good, what's called a biblical theology, which is trying to put the themes of the Bible together from beginning to end and kind of saying, okay, what's kind of the overall theme of the whole story of the Bible? And he writes a book called The King and His Beauty. And in the section on Esther, he talks about, he says, the narrator, he kind of explains the story of Esther too. He says, the narrator betrays no interest in moralizing over the king's behavior or the queen's refusal to do what the king demanded. So remember last chapter, Xerxes demands something, Vashti doesn't do it, and that kind of sets up for the story. It says, the point of the story is that God was secretly and unobtrusively working in human affairs, for by this means the pathway was open for Esther to replace Vashti as queen. Esther was now in position to advocate for the Jews at the crucial moment. Following Mordecai's command, she had not revealed that she was Jewish, which is another way of saying that she had not disclosed that she worshipped Yahweh. The author, by twice reflecting on Esther's being Jewish, foreshadows a theme that will play a central role in the story. So we see all these things, and what we're actually going to see, because sometimes there's things with Esther that it's like, well, what can we get out of Esther? Well, just be like Esther or be like Mordecai, and that's somewhat appropriate. There's MacArthur's 12 Extraordinary Women, and it has a chapter on Esther, right? And there are character things where you could be like Esther or you could be like Mordecai, but there are also things that we'll see in Esther that are imperfections, and the Bible's not painting over flaws of either Esther or Mordecai, and we kind of see this in this chapter that's kind of laid out. And in movies or things like this is almost like it became popular over the last, I would say it was always around, but it was also in the 2000s more so in movies that I noticed, is more of like an anti-hero, the person who they weren't like Superman. They weren't like a totally good person all the time, or like Captain America or someone like that. They had these problems, they had these moral failings, they had these flaws, but they were also accomplishing something ultimately good, even if they weren't necessarily even a good person in movies and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that's necessarily how Esther is, but it is honest about raising some questions about these characters and their moral imperfections and the imperfections of a sinful world, and not being in Jerusalem and being in Persia, this other kingdom. So let's look at the first point and read through Esther 2, 1 through 4, and the irrevocable decree. So kings make decrees, and remember that in the Medes and the Persians, their laws are supposed to be, the king's laws, once they're out there, they're supposed to be irrevocable. Okay, so let's read together Esther 2, 1 through 4. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. The king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let cosmetics be given to them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Okay, so now we see this setup for the story. What you need to know, first of all, is that there's been time. There's time that has elapsed between this point and the point where Esther gets chosen and the first chapter. Chapter 1, verse 3 talks about in Ahasuerus' third year of his reign. Chapter 2 happens in the 7th year of his reign. 2:16 talks about when he finally chooses Esther. It's during the 7th year of his reign. But there's this period of a couple years in between. So what was happening in between there, where he, removes Vashti from the throne, divorces her? What does he do? He goes to war. He goes to war and goes on a really unsuccessful military campaign, which isn't the point, here, but it's just helpful to understand that. He goes to war for a few years in Greece. Greece is going to be the next major empire on the world stage. They don't know that yet, but that's how it's going to unfold. And so during the intervening time, he goes and does this disastrous military campaign in Greece. He has this naval defeat at this place called Salamis in 480 BC, and he also gets routed. His army gets routed at a place called Plataea in 489. So he fails, and the pagan historian Herodotus tells us that he came back, and his plan was, okay, that didn't work out, to extend his empire. And so you can already see that the empire is not going to be, the total ruler of the earth, at least for very long. And so he comes back and he wants to find solace in his harem. He's like, okay, well, maybe if I find a new wife, that'll, make me feel better. And so he comes back, remembers what Vashti had done, what he had done to her, what the whole situation was, and like, okay, well, let's look, somewhere else for comfort. His reign's not very long. The story of Esther happens, I wrote up here, so you can see between Esther and Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah. It happens in about a span of about 10 years. His Xerxes' reign is not very long until his son takes over, and then his son is on the throne when Nehemiah is his cupbearer and goes to rebuild the city and rebuild the walls. So this is what's been going on. There's been some elapsing in time. And remember, Ahasuerus, his big thing is drinking. And you're going to keep seeing that throughout the chapters. Not so much in this one, but it's going to be his tell. It's kind of like in, I thought about how to explain this a little bit. Have you guys seen Ocean's 11?
Yes.
Okay. It's a heist movie where you have to try to rob this guy or whatever. You guys seen Ocean's 11? Okay. Well, then maybe I won't explain. But Brad Pitt is in it. Okay, so it's all these con men. They get together to rob this other con man, in Las Vegas. It's a pretty good movie if you like that type of heist movie with a little bit of how do they plan to rob this vault or whatever in Las Vegas. Anyway, but Brad Pitt in every scene, he's always eating something. His character is like waiting for his friend to get out of jail. He has a sandwich. He's, in this hotel, he has a donut. He's in this, like every scene. And it's on purpose. It's, to make something kind of unique about his character. That's kind of how Xerxes is with drinking alcohol. He's always, every time he's doing something, he has a drink in his hand. And then there's a point where he sets the drink down and it's like, okay, something's going to happen there. Okay, so notice verse 1, it says, after these things, he remembered what Vashti had done and what had been decreed against her. So now, this decree has been made. He talked to his counselors, his advisors, and they said, well, here's what you should do, so that all the women in the kingdom won't raise up against their husbands like Vashti did you. throw her out, divorce her, depose her from the throne, and then, bring in all the women that you can find, all the young unmarried women, and you have your choice of them, and put someone better than she in her place. That's what the end of Esther 1 talks about. Okay, and so he says, okay, and then he goes on his military campaign. Doesn't work out. He comes back, and he plans to do this. And so even if, now there's no hint either way, but even if the king wanted to restore Vashti, legally he couldn't, because he already made the decree. It's just like when Darius said, this is how Daniel ends up in the lion's den, even though Darius realized, whoa, wait, this affected Daniel. He told him not to pray, and then Daniel prayed, and he's like, wait a second, I didn't think this law was going to affect him, and so he had to do it. Okay, so this is like what's called the law of the Medes and the Persians. Let me read Daniel 6:15 just to explain this. It says, recognize, O king. This is the speakers to the king in the situation with Daniel in Daniel 6. So recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So they had a high view of the rule of law, that even the king had to obey the law. And so decree, that word, is something that comes up quite a few times in Esther, the decree of the king. And it's also something that came up previously in the book of Daniel. Daniel's in the Babylonian captivity living up to before this time, but fairly recently in history. And in Daniel's pattern, the decrees of kings are made, but God is the one who ultimately shifts things around so that they don't last. Only the decrees of God are the ones that last. And so the question is, are we going to kind of see that same pattern unfolding in Esther? Now the king's made a decree, and he's going to make other decrees, but can there be some way that this can be solved? Can there be some way these things can be reversed? Okay, so the king, ultimately, you see that Xerxes or Ahasuerus is not even in charge of the decree that he has made. It kind of now rules him. Okay, and so remember also, so look at verse 3, Haggai the eunuch. So remember, eunuchs move the story forward. When you hear that, you know something's going to happen. They appear at different strategic times through the text. So the story's about to advance. Okay, so let's look at the second point, Mordecai and Esther, where they get introduced. Let me ask not a trick question, but it's a little unfair because I reminded myself and had the answer. But what is Esther's real name? Does anybody know off the top of their head? What is Esther's real name?
Hadassah.
Hadassah, yeah. Why don't we call her that? How come we're not studying, Hadassah? Her Persian name is Esther. Daniel's Hebrew name is Daniel. Does anybody know what Daniel's changed Babylonian name was? Belteshazzar, yeah. So we don't call him with that. Okay. So it even tells you something that's like Esther is, called by her Persian name. It's more of a Persian book, if you will. It's still, it's in that context, very much so. So let me read 2:5-7, and let's think about those things together. It says, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, a son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and of face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay, so now we have these main characters introduced, who are cousins of sorts. Mordecai. Okay, and by the way, when it says that he was taken in the exile of Nebuchadnezzar, it's really talking about Kish, his relative. Mordecai wouldn't have been old enough to be taken back then. He wouldn't have this is too far forward to be taken back during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But when it talks about who was taken during that time, it's talking about Kish, his either grandfather or relative during that time. And then Mordecai would have been born into that situation of exile, either under the Babylonians or under the Persians. So anyway, talks about Mordecai. It identifies him as a Jew, and it identifies him as Mordecai, a Benjamite. So Mordecai, his name is a Hebraized form of, he's actually named after a Babylonian god named Marduk. There's Mordecai is his name. And so there's this kind of Hebraizing, kind of making it a little bit more Jewish or familiar to his language. But he's named after a Persian or a Babylonian god. And so imagine, he's being given an idolatrous name in the Babylonian exile or later. And this was pretty common. A Hebrew and a Babylonian name were pretty similar for the same person. Like I said, they renamed Daniel. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were renamed as well. In fact, I think those are their renames. They're not their original names. But anyway, Mordecai is also called a Jew. This is now today it's like, okay, well, what's the big deal about that? Jew is actually a newer term during this time. It's people from the land of Judah. They started to be called Jews after the Babylonian captivity, after they started returning to the land of Judah. This is where they start to become known as Jews rather than Israelites. And so anyway, but he's identified as a Jew, which is a title given to people after the Babylonian exile or captivity. And he may have also been a eunuch. He may have also been put into the king's service, undergone that process to become a eunuch, because he has no wife or family are mentioned. That's a little bit of some guesswork, but there's some reasons to think that, because 2:7 says that he has no wife or children are mentioned. And he also has access in Esther 2:11 to the women's quarters, and so you didn't have guys just walking around in the women's quarters unless they were eunuchs. Okay, now who else? Now he's a Benjamite, or his tribe. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Who else in biblical history? Not that recent, but recent maybe with this Sunday school class. Who else in biblical history was from the tribe of Benjamin? Very famous individual. Huh?
Paul?
Well, yeah, Paul is, but that's later. This is looking back.
King Saul.
Saul, yeah. So close, yeah,
Close.
yeah. Saul, yeah. So Saul is a Benjamite as well. So now we have this theme that's going to come up later, and there's going to be this tension, because remember, Saul. One of the things that was the final strike that the kingdom and the throne was removed from him is God told him to go kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and exterminate the Amalekites from the land. He doesn't do that. He doesn't fully obey the Lord. He takes Agag prisoner, lets some of them go, and so that line continues to live on. What we learn later, this a little bit of a glimpse ahead, is that Haman is an Agagite. He's an Amalekite. And so there's going to be that tension now between those two lines, again, because of when Saul failed to obey the word of the Lord the first time. Now the line of Saul is experiencing the consequences of that in the future. We also don't see the line of David. I mean, where's the line of David here? It's not mentioned. It's not really prevalent in Ezra and Nehemiah either, and that's the one that there's supposed to be all this hope from and everything. But notice in the verse 6, the word exile is used twice, so this is very much on people's minds, the focus on that they've been removed from their land. Esther happens in that context of God's judgment of them, of their exile, but also remember they had an opportunity to return back to the land after 538 with Cyrus. Okay, so they had this opportunity to return back to the land. A lot of Jews didn't. And that's what the situation is of Mordecai and Esther. And so it doesn't answer the question, it just raises it. Why are these Jews still in the land? How come they haven't gone back with the faithful remnant to Jerusalem? And it doesn't tell us, it just kind of suggests. It doesn't give us an answer to that. But notice also in verse 6, it explains the situation of the exile that was under Jeconiah, the king of Judah. Okay, so Jeconiah was one of the last Davidic kings. He's on the throne, and he was so bad, he was so disobedient to the Lord, that not only was he going to be thrown into exile, Babylonian captivity, the Babylonians were going to come in, they were going to destroy the temple, they were going to undo everything, they were going to take all the people into their land, but he got an extra curse from God beyond that. Let me read Jeremiah 22:24-27. It talks about God's saying to him, "As I live, declares the Lord, even though Coniah," which is a nickname for Jeconiah, "the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were a great signet ring on my right hand, yet I would pull it off, and I would give you over into the hands of those who are seeking your life. Yes, into the hand of those whom you dread, even the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, into the hand of the Chaldeans." And when they're called Chaldeans, remember Abraham came from, they're usually called Babylonians, but Abraham came from Ur of Chaldees. So it's like saying, look, this is being stripped back all the way back to the beginning because you failed so badly. Verse 26, "I will hurl you and the mother who bore you into another country where you were not born, and there you will die. But as for the land which they desire to return, they will not return to it." So that's the exile. Okay, so the Davidic kings have failed. The Davidic line has failed. God's been faithful to his promises, because part of the promises of the Davidic covenant was when the Davidic king, who is in a position as God's son, sins, God's going to discipline him. So that's what's happening. They can only bring on discipline to themselves. They can't unlock all the promises of the Davidic covenant, because no king is able to turn away the wrath of God and obey. Now, Jeconiah is so bad, he gets a bonus curse. In Jeremiah 22:30, "Thus says the Lord, write this man down childless." Now, he has children, but listen to what the Lord says. He says, "A man who will not prosper in his days, for no man of his descendants will prosper sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah." Meaning no one in Jeconiah's family line can be on the throne of David anymore. The Davidic kings are done. They're suspended for the time being until God chooses to resume it, okay, with another Davidic king. We don't see kings in Ezra and Nehemiah. We see Zerubbabel, who's in the line of the kings, but he's not a king. He's not ruling on the throne. Now the interesting thing is, Haggai the prophet comes during this time when they stop building, and they're wondering, if we build the temple, does our obedience really matter? And Haggai says, yes, it does. You need to build God's house and be about what God's doing, because your obedience is going to be used in God's plan. And then he talks about that there's going to be this coming Zerubbabel, kind of like a coming David, the Messiah. And he says, and he's going to be a signet ring on my hand, meaning he's going to be the Davidic king to accomplish these things. But during this time, no king. So this is in the minds of people who would be reading Esther, this history of what's happened to cause the exile in the first place. So some of the question is, in history, is the house of David lost? We know that the answer is no. But, how? How is this going to happen, all work together? They thought the temple could never be destroyed. The temple gets destroyed. They said in Jeremiah, they had this dumb song that they were like, we have the temple of the Lord. And they would sing this little song. Nothing bad can happen to us because we have the temple of the Lord. Then the temple got destroyed, and they were like, it totally undid their worldview. And so anyway, this is some of the questions or the things that would be in people's minds as they would be reading this. Jeremiah also promised that in Jeremiah 24 that there would be people protected in exile. There would be a basket of, he has this vision. God explains to him, there's a basket of bad figs, that are rotten fruit, and good figs that are good fruit. And so there's that kind of idea here with Esther and Mordecai, that they're probably the good figs, right? But we see their imperfections as well. So let's look at verse 7. Hadassah, whose name is Esther. So her Persian name is Esther. It's from the Persian word for star. She's also named after a Persian or a Babylonian deity named Ishtar, or in Hebrew you would call it Ashtaroth. Okay, so you imagine being named after she may not, it may not have been a big deal to her to have a Persian name because she, grew up being young in this system. But imagine your name being changed from something that's biblical. Names were a lot more had a lot more specific focus in that time than they do now. But being changed to something of a false god or something like that. So anyway, she's named after Ishtar, the Babylonian god of the stars. And so her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, which is a fairly rare word in the Old Testament. But some of the things that are interesting from this is that Zechariah, who's a prophet during this time, he has a vision of the Lord. He has a vision of the angel of the Lord who's equivalent with God himself. And there's these horses in Zechariah 1. And 3 times it mentioned angel of the Lord standing between the myrtle trees. And these myrtle trees represent this hope for Israel. In Isaiah, way earlier, before the exile, there's supposed to be this sign of hope for the Messianic kingdom and God's hope. And now you have this girl whose name is Hadassah, whose name is Myrtle. So it's like, okay, there's this glimmer of hope, but that's not what she's called. She's called Esther. Okay, so there's this, kind of tension. Like, okay, there's a balance of hope, but also, you wonder a little bit at how it's going to actually unfold. Okay, so we're informed of her actual name. And then so we have here the realities of exile really personified in these 2 people. They're Jews in exile. So remember the Czechs thing I was talking. So they're Jews in exile. They did not return to Jerusalem. So, there's some reason to question that. Why didn't Mordecai, it's one thing for Esther, she's a young woman who's born in a situation, but why didn't Mordecai go back? It doesn't mean he was a bad guy for not doing it. It just means we just wonder. Okay, they're Jews named after Babylonian gods. Okay, they're Jews from the house of Saul, not David. Mordecai has no family. Esther has no parents. Okay, so and those may have been the consequences of exile. Maybe their families died because of that situation of exile. We don't know. So you see all these things, and there are some things that are, raise questions in our mind as to why aren't they with the faithful remnant that went back with Ezra and those following him. So now we see that these women are going to be forcibly taken and involuntarily collected to be brought to the king so that he can select a new wife. And so these 2 are not presented, Mordecai and Ezra, they're not presented as likely heroes, like, okay, we can tell that this person's going to save the whole situation. Because that's actually not the point of Mordecai and Esther. They're important in the plan of God. But it's really God who's at work. It's the invisible God working these things together. So they're kind of unlikely heroes. They're not supposed to be like ideal people. There's actually contrasts between people like Daniel. Okay, Daniel's sin is not mentioned. It's something like that. And he's kind of seen as like this ideal guy. You see his character coming out, and Daniel standing up for what's right, being willing to suffer for the consequences. In Esther and Mordecai, you see it's a little bit different. They try to avoid different things and plan different things that aren't always the right way to go about it, but God's still working it out. That's what we really see here. Okay, so the text raises some of these questions, and it doesn't answer them. It just, has us think about these things as the story moves on. So let's look at Esther 2, 8 through 11. When we see Esther finds favor, that kind of third point here, it really covers 8 through 16. We'll break it down a little bit. Esther 2, 8 So it came about when the command and decree, so remember that word decree, of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa in the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace in the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Okay, so this is a thing about this in the context in which it happened. This real event. It's a sad and it's a tragic event of the tyranny of a king. And Esther doesn't spend a lot of time moralizing over, okay, well, by the way, this was wrong or this was right. It just tells us the story. But, imagine this idea of women being taken forcibly from their homes, their fathers collected, and then going into a harem and, being selected by the king. Now, the harem, sometimes that would have some benefits, but also being pretty much kidnapped and taken over there to forcibly face the king. Now we also see some other things with Esther. So after she's captured, taken to the palace, she finds favor with this eunuch Hegai. Okay, so he treats her well, and so he's treating. It's kind of like Joseph in Egypt, or Joseph in Genesis, where those different situations where wherever he's at, he gets. The Lord has favor with him. So anyway, but Esther's treated well, and he helps her kind of advance, and he takes care of her a little bit. Mordecai has some access and is able to visit her. But notice also, Esther 2:9, he gives her food, he gives her cosmetics. Okay, this sounds nice. But remember Daniel chapter 1, the big controversy when Daniel and his 3 friends get taken. That begins is that they refuse to eat the king's food. Esther, we don't hear anything about that, right? She doesn't bring up dietary restrictions. She doesn't even bring up, verses 10 and 11, she doesn't even bring up that she's a Jew. Because Mordecai's told her, don't say that. Now, why did he tell her to say that? He doesn't know that she's going to be selected queen or anything like that. He doesn't, why did he tell her to maybe lie or withhold information? Or to break, probably dietary law, or to, be in a situation where she may marry a Gentile. Now, she doesn't have a choice, right? She's in this situation by force. So, it's not like we say, okay, well, she should have done differently. We weren't there. But it's just, you see there's a kind of a contrast or a comparison between Daniel and his friends. Said they tried to figure it out. Hey, look, we won't eat the king's food, but here's an alternative. And they tried to, say, okay, if we can still do our duties and not eat the king's food, then let us, leave us alone, and we'll still do that. Okay, but we don't really see that. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference there. But you can see also the kind of hope there too is that God doesn't just use people like Daniel. It's like I don't know. Like sometimes when we're young, we like to think of ourselves as like being the good guy in the story or whatever. And sometimes like, okay, yeah, I'd be like Daniel. But I don't know, Esther and Mordecai, they're imperfect. And we see their imperfections spelled out a little bit for us. But God is still using them as well. So it's not like, just people of the character of Daniel get used by the Lord. It's, there are people that the Lord can use anyone. But anyway, so he, on the advice of Mordecai, she conceals this essential thing about her identity. And the interesting thing through this is that by them doing that, something that's, maybe not great, that Mordecai at least told her not to do that, that's going to unfold later in the story, because later she is going to reveal that she's a Jew, and that's going to be essential, right? So this is, Mordecai told her not to tell the truth, but later it's going to unfold as an essential part of the narrative. So there are these different things going on that God really is working through all these events. So they didn't make a principled stand there and say, I'm not going to eat the king's food. I'm not going to bow down before the idol. I'm not going to, stop praying to the Lord. But they just tried to keep it quiet. Now, why would Mordecai want Esther to marry a Gentile? Remember, one of the big things, Ezra and Nehemiah, Malachi, and in the law, Deuteronomy 7:5, there was not to be this it wasn't interracial, it was not to be this interfaith marriage to Gentiles who had not converted to worshiping the Lord. And so, I don't know if Mordecai even thinks it's likely that she'll get chosen, but he just says, look, just don't tell him you're a Jew. Don't tell him you're a worshiper of Yahweh. And she doesn't. But, she's going to be forced into a situation where she maybe has to marry a Gentile, pagan ruler, right? It's unlikely, but we know, that is what's going to happen in the story, right? So this was the greatest, marrying Gentiles, unbelievers, was the greatest sin during this time, during this era. Well, not idolatry, but intermarriage with others of other faiths. Big in Ezra, big in Nehemiah, and now Esther marries Ahasuerus later on in the chapter. Okay, so there are these things. Okay, let's go on 12 through 14. Let's read those together. Now, when the turn of each lady, so it's kind of like American Idol. No, I'm just kidding. Now, when the turn of each lady came to go into King Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months, under the regulations for women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with spices and cosmetics. So you get 6 months each with those things. Verse 13, the young lady would go to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given to her to take from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Xerxes, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Okay, so here's the setup. And I joked that it was like American Idol, and this is where, and I don't know how you do this with a cartoon or teaching this to kids, but have you guys seen the VeggieTales one of Esther? No, you haven't?
Yes.
They saw it where she goes up and she sings, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, she sings. So it really is like an American Idol thing. So VeggieTales doesn't really get it right, surprisingly. But so they go through this 12-month period of beautification or whatever here, and they get prepared and taken in. But then they go in one by one, and I mean, listen to verse 14. If this makes you uncomfortable, that's what it's supposed to do. It doesn't spell it out in a real graphic way or anything, but it makes you feel like, okay, there's something going on. And that's what good writing does, by the way. It's like a difference between mystery novels and something like where something bad happened. It doesn't spell it out all the way. And then you get writers in the later period, like Stephen King, they spell out all the graphic details of these horrible things, and it's just it's better some things are left unsaid and leave some things to the imagination. But listen to verse 14. It says, in the evening, talking about these women one by one, in the evening she would go in the morning she would return to the second harem. Okay, and it's well, were they just, so that's the thing. It's it makes us a little bit uncomfortable. It's a little bit ambiguous, we're not naive, and if we are naive, that's fine. That's okay too. But leaning toward questionable. Now, these women are forced into this situation. Okay, so it's we could all imagine what would you do in that type of situation. You're there by force. I mean, you can't leave. You make a stand and get executed or something. It's like I talk in U.S. history, we talk about slavery or different things like this. And, I show some videos that talk about narratives from people who were interviewed who were slaves back in the 20s, who, lived a long time. So they're in their 80s or, some almost 100 years old. And they speak about that situation. And they, so interesting details there. But then, some of the bad things that happened to them. And I'm talking this over with my 8th grade students, and they're like, well, I would have just fought them. I would have fought them off and gotten out of there. And I'm like, okay, you thought no one would have thought of that? That no one ever, or being captured on a slave ship or something, that, yeah, people fought sometimes, and sometimes they, got a few points for that, I guess, or they avoided the situation a little bit further, but you're under a whole system of kidnapping and slavery. You don't get to just, as noble as that may be, fight it off, right? So it's easy to think of a situation where it's like you weren't there, like, oh, well, Esther should have stood up to him or something. It's like, well, she doesn't do that, okay? And so anyway, but yeah, these women do this. And the other sad thing here is that after this, if the king didn't, call her back, that was it. She probably just stayed in the harem. She'd live as kind of like a widow. She'd be she'd be in the harem. They'd have food. They'd have provisions and things like this. They'd probably live wealthier than a lot of women in Persia during that time, but they're husbandless. They're childless. They live there alone, or with these other women in a similar situation. So this is a common thing sometimes in the ancient Near East. So anyway, this is the situation for Esther. So let's look at verse 15 through 20. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, so we're introduced to her father, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. So she takes advice from Hegai about what to take to impress him. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month of Tebeth in the 7th year of his reign. So see, it's some time's passed since chapter 1. So it's in the 7th year of his reign now. And so she takes in what Hegai advises. Hegai's a eunuch. So story's moving forward. And something important is going to happen. She finds favor with everybody who sees her. Hegai knows what the king likes, is able to kind of help Esther out with that. And the king falls in love with her. He chooses Esther. So she's able to ingratiate herself to the king by doing this. Okay, let's look at verses 17 through 20. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all the princes and servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. So Mordecai's still advising her here. So you see that the king falls in love with her. He throws this banquet, this feast for Esther in her honor, makes a holiday. There's likely here this includes gifts, this includes a remission of taxes, this includes a bunch of different things that it really does. Yeah, you eased back on the taxes when you did that as king. And so there's kind of this this restoration of this marriage picture. Now it's a sinful world, and it's a sinful situation, and it's imperfect people, and it's a pagan king. But you see there's this kind of softening of the consequences of sin and different things with marriage, that God's plan for marriage has benefits that extend into the world, even if people aren't believers. You see this kind of these benefits flowing from this, even from Ahasuerus being king. So there's these different things that there's kind of this peace restored there. Okay, so he throws this thing in Esther's honor. Now remember, one of the themes in Esther, God's not mentioned, so one of the things you're supposed to be looking at is luck, chance, coincidence, fortune, that type of thing. We know those things don't really exist, but that's what it's supposed to make us think. We know how the story is, but it's like despite all odds, Esther gets chosen. Like, what are the chances? But there are no chances. The Lord was working these things out specifically so that Esther could be chosen for this. And so, but I don't know how many women were chosen, but it was all the women, all the maidens from all the provinces are brought in, and out of all of them, he chooses one woman who is already in Susa, this young woman, Esther. It's kind of unlikely. I mean, I don't know how many young women were in the provinces of Persia during this time. But you could imagine that the idea that one person, that this person, this Jew who's hiding that she's a Jew, would be chosen out of all the people. Like, there are other Jews too. It's not, there are other people who could have been chosen. But out of all of them, Esther gets chosen. Okay, so we're supposed to be like, well, that was lucky, or one of the things in Esther is lots, like throwing the dice. That's what the holiday that comes out of Esther, Purim, is named after, is lots. It's like when you roll the dice and you get a certain result. That's what we're going to see later on. But it's like, okay, well, what are the chances? Well, the invisible God is bringing these things together for a specific purpose, to save his people. And then Esther will end here with the last part, the plot. So this also brings out the importance of Mordecai as well, verses 21 through 23. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on the gallows. And it was written in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. Okay, so Mordecai, again, he's walking around. He has access to the king's, area, to different areas in the palace or whatever. And so he's walking around and he discovers this plot. He happens to find this plot of these other likely eunuchs as well, who they're angry at the king. They're coming up with some type of plan to kill him. He hears it, just happens to. Okay, now his cousin is also on the throne as the queen. Okay, that's lucky, right? Quote marks. He tells her. Now she informs the king. The king investigates it, right? And then it becomes known. The king also has it written down and documented, and then he forgets about it. He's like, okay, that's done. Thank you, and moves on. And these two guys now this is foreshadowing. Okay, these two guys get hanged on the gallows. Now in the West, we have hanged, which is by rope. Okay, you think that the like Western movies or something like that what execution in like Britain and America was by hanging by rope. Hanging in the ancient Near Eastern context is impalement. It's not hanging by rope. You're hanged by being thrown down on a pike or something like that. So that's, by the way, when it talks about like cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, that's what it's talking about. It's talking about a disjointed hanging of someone who's been pierced or something like that. Or a crucifixion is similar. Okay, so that you see the connections there between the Old Testament and crucifixion. And you also see, by the way, this is totally rabbit trail, but when it says that Judas went out and hanged himself, and then it says in Acts that his bowels spilled out on the field, some people try to say, well, maybe the rope broke and stuff. It's a lot simpler if you understand hanging as, okay, he threw himself down on a rock and hanged himself, and his bowels spilled out on the field. That makes total sense. but they're hung on a gallows. Okay, so this will become important later on, not only to understand the meaning of that, for what that means for a crucifixion and things of that nature, but also in the context of the story of Esther, we have a little bit of foreshadowing here. Okay, the gallows, the hanging, is going to become important because Haman's going to want to construct a gallows. Okay, let me finish here with a quote on Esther. It says, "The leading characters." Now, so we've seen a lot of things about Esther, Mordecai, about Ahasuerus. Haman's going to be introduced as the bad guy. But we've seen, their imperfections. We've seen their moral flaws. If we were included in a book of the Bible, okay, and the Bible is honest about us, just like it was about Moses, just like it is about Peter, just like it is about Esther, just like it is about, lots of people, and our flaws were laid out, in an honest way, and how God used us, you could imagine, right? So we've seen some of their imperfections, but the point here is that God doesn't need it's not just someone like Daniel. It's that these are people that God uses in spite of ourselves. He uses them because he's the hidden God working these things together. So God's really the main character of the story in a brilliant way because he's not even mentioned. He can totally stay out of it. So let me read this quote. It says, the leading characters do not consistently exhibit noble qualities. Xerxes was cruel, sensual, and capricious. Esther was willing to hide her identity and become queen and did not appear reluctant to marry a Gentile. Mordecai advised her to conceal her identity in order to become queen. So there's some questionable, there's some definite things that are wrong, like things that Ahasuerus does, kidnapping women to choose a new queen, okay? No doubt about that. The Bible doesn't give us, and by the way, that was wrong or this was right. But then there's also some things that raise some questions, and there's some ambiguity. Esther goes in and spends the night with the king. She doesn't tell who she really is. Mordecai advises her to do that. So there's some things there. But we see that through those imperfections, that God is working together his plan for his kingdom in history. And so remember, Daniel presents all the kingdoms of the earth are going to be destroyed by this big stone that's going to be that's going to fill the whole earth and be the kingdom of God. Also that the Son of Man, in Daniel's vision, Daniel 7, is going to be the ultimate ruler over all the kingdoms of the earth, and all their kings are going to come to the end. But this is happening very much in where there is a powerful king in Persia. And the question is Daniel, what Daniel said, his theology, is that going to actually work out in history? Is God really going to be able to save his people in the midst of a pagan kingdom? And the truth is that empires and kingdoms, they fall, they crumble, or they go into decline. And so, we can see even today that Persia is not, it's not a military empire. There is no Persia to speak of really today. The region still exists, but there's nothing like this. There's nothing like Babylon. There's different things. So these empires, historically, they just go into decline or they collapse. But when you're in it, just like imagine today, if someone talked about the collapse of American empire, just the big power on the earth today, you'd probably think, well, that would be unlikely. But you never know. Just in moving on, the kingdoms of the earth, the only one that's guaranteed is the kingdom of God and his ruler, the Son of Man, or the Messiah. So anyway, that's what we're really looking forward to, and that's what we're really seeing is this unfolding in history in Esther. So let's close here in prayer, and then we will get out of here to go to worship. Lord God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the way we can see in a documented historical event you're working, even though you chose in your will not to be named, not to be directly identified. And Lord, we I just praise you that you can work in imperfect people, that you can work in all these details. And Lord, we pray that you'll give us commitment to your kingdom, not to the kingdoms of this earth, but that we'd be committed to the kingdom of God, first in us and in our hearts and in the church, but also looking forward to seeing that unfold in the earth, Lord, with Christ as King. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.